Okay, so we're looking at here is just we're going to talk about the end of the war. But before we get to the end of the war, I just want to kind of recap because we've had a weird hiatus between really the start of what we talked about with World War One and where we are currently towards the end of the war. So just to kind of recap, remember the main causes, the long-term causes of World War One: militarism, alliances, that industrial and imperial competition, and nationalism. That these undercurrents had been kind of festering in Europe for quite some time, and that they come to light. They come to the surface really with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo. And this is really what causes the war to break out and really bring in all of Europe with its allies and alliances and so forth and so on. I understand that the initial stages of the war were the Germans invading France through Belgium via what they call the Schlieffen Plan. And you remember, think of that map in your head. Germany is stuck between France and Russia, who are allies. They realize they can't win a war fighting both of them simultaneously. So the plan is to fight one and then turn around and fight the other. They believe they can knock France out of the war first, then turn around and fight Russia. So that's why the Schlieffen Plan goes into effect. It turns out not to work. The French are able to withstand the assault, and the Russians actually mobilize a little bit ahead of time. And so Germany does get stuck fighting a two-front war. Except it's not the war they anticipated, as the kind of defense takes over, as men dig in and form entrenchments or trenches that allow them to kind of hold the line, if you will. So what was expected to be this kind of fast-moving war becomes a bit of a stalemate with static front lines. To break through this defense, we see new tactics, but probably more importantly, new weapons in terms of, poison gas, tanks, airplanes, really early flamethrowers. So you really have in a terrible way, a blossoming of different scientific weapons here that are created. Unfortunately, none of them are really effective at breaking the stalemate because the trenches are, there's so many trenches. It's trench followed by support trench, followed by reserve trench. And then, 10 miles beyond that, there's other sets of trenches as well. So the idea here is that, you might be able to take over one trench, but it is so difficult to hold on to them that it becomes just impractical and almost impossible. So the point here is that these trenches, if you will, make for a defensive war and kind of force the creation of weapons to overcome them, which really don't until the bitter end of the war when they're used in conjunction with one another. We talked about propaganda. Remember, propaganda is trying to convince people to come around to your perspective, your way of thinking. The RR, the EE, and the BB. Propaganda has three goals primarily. One of the three goals, which is to reinforce righteousness. So reinforce the righteousness of your cause. You're on the right side. You're the good guy. You're doing the right thing. Which keeps morale up. It encourages enlistment. The EE encourage enlistment. Have young men sign up, young women sign up, volunteer, serve in the Army, the Navy, Marines, the Air Force, which didn't exist at this time, but you get the idea. The Red Cross, sign up and join and help out. And then the BB, to buy bonds, to pay for the war. So the idea here is that they need people to sign up and pay money, because the more money the government can borrow from its citizens, the less it has to pay back to banks at exorbitantly high interest rates. And then don't forget, too, that this is a total war because people at home are affected by it. Certainly the United States not as affected by the war because, again, we are out of the war for 3 years and we only enter it on the fourth. But in England and France and Russia and Germany, there are dramatic effects, whether it be the draft or conscription, forcing young people to join in, utilizing youth groups to collect recycling and tin cans and things along those lines or extra cash. Women fulfilling the roles of men in factories and society in certain ways as the men are off to war. So women kind of step up and become more prominent members of society, certainly in the workforce. And then certainly at the end of the war, the tail end, and as the war is over, the Spanish influenza, Spanish flu, which really comes and wreaks havoc on the world and actually has a higher death count than World War One. And then just earlier this week, we talked about Russia leaving the war and America getting involved. Remember, by 1917, it was more lines of, what country is going to crack first because this great victory is not going to be achieved. So Russia's the first to crack in large part because of incompetent leadership by the Tsar and the Tsarina. There's a revolution in March 1917, which really forces the Tsar to accept a more democratic form of government. That government continues in the war and leads to a second revolution in October. This revolution is led by communists, by Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, among others, and they're going to really force the Russians to back out of the war. So the communist revolution comes to power. They sue for peace with the Germans. The war with Germany ends. World War I for Russia ends as they back out of the war, give the Germans a bunch of territory, and a civil war between the communists and the non-communists in Russia really begins. And that's really all you need to know. We're going to get more into it next week, but just kind of have in the back of your head, Tsar's incompetence, one revolution, Russia stays in, second revolution, Russia backs out of the war, and then Russia's busy fighting a civil war amongst itself. And as Russia backs out, America really starts to jump in. America gets involved because of unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmerman telegram, the concept that we have to make the world safe for democracy. So we really get pulled in here at the end of the war. And I know on paper it would make sense that, well, America didn't have a big army at this time. And with Russia's withdrawal, it seems like we're not really balancing the shift. But you have to understand that, yeah, let's say Russia and America even out in terms of military might, which industrial output doesn't make any sense. But let's, for argument's sake, let's say that's the case. America's new. We're fresh. We're the doughboys. The idea that we are going to go overseas and be able to invigorate the front lines. This is not like you're fighting the Russians who've been fighting for years. You're fighting Americans who are brand new equipment, lots of personnel coming in. So that kind of boost of energy, that boost of fresh faces really is what going to push the Allies forward. Though to be fair to Britain and France, the Germans had been kind of reeling for quite some time, and we're relying more and more on those defensive fortifications. So how does the war come to an end? All right. And how does this thing happen? Well, World War I ends with an armistice on November 11th, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, all right, in 1918. So 1918, the war is over. Now, the Germans had sued for peace. They basically said, listen, we got to stop fighting because we know we're not going to win. The Germans recognize that they are not going to win World War I, and because they cannot win, well, then continuing to fight is stupid. So keep in mind, there's an important point here. The Germans didn't surrender. They sued for peace. And that distinction didn't really make it across to the British, the British, the French, and the Americans, who viewed the Germans as surrendering. The German population looked at it as suing for peace. They looked at it as like, well, someone has to be the adult here and end the fight because this has gone on long enough and we're not getting anywhere. So the Germans sue for peace. And, what happens to them kind of helps explain what happens in Germany for the next couple of decades. So in 1919, a couple months after the armistice, there's going to be a peace conference at Paris, at the Palace of Versailles. We call it the Paris Peace Conference. And you have delegates from 32 countries, but delegates from all around the world arrive to kind of take part in the peace talks. Now, the argument here is that you're going to remake Europe. You're going to find out what's going on because the Ottoman Empire has collapsed. Austria-Hungary has collapsed. Who knows what to do with the Russian government and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and all that land. So there's a million questions that really need to be addressed and resolved to prevent this war from happening again. So we're going to remake Europe, and because Europe has so many colonies, you're really remaking the world. The problem is you didn't invite two countries in particular. Germany was not invited, nor was Russia. Russia was not invited, A, because the people here do not like communism, and B, Russia backed out of the war. So it's kind of like screw you. They're not invited to the peace conference since they left the conflict. And the Germans are left out because they're going to be told they're accepting blame for this. The Germans sued for peace. That's good enough, close enough to a surrender for the Allies, the Americans, the British, and the French. And there you go. Now that's pretty dramatic when you think about it. And it kind of explains why the Germans are going to get so angry and be so upset. Now, what you see here are the big four. All right, these are the leaders of the four victorious countries, the four major victorious countries. And they are President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. All right, see his picture there. Georges Clemenceau from France. David Lloyd George from Britain. And Vittorio Orlando from Italy. Really, it's the big three, but, Vittorio Orlando gets added in there because Italy is kind of, their role is limited, but they do get a presence because, one, I think Eurocentrism, and two, because the Allies had promised Italy a whole bunch of stuff for entering the war after the war actually started. Wilson arrives at this thing because he's Woodrow Wilson and he's a self-pompous, aggrandizing jerk. He arrives and is treated like a rock star. I mean, when he arrives, the Europeans, there are huge crowds greeting him. They view him as a potential savior because here's a guy who's going to bring the American way, because the Americans stayed out of the war. The Americans didn't end the war until the very last year, and even then, just kind of push it over the top. So we were seen as like double winners. We didn't slog through 4 years of brutal conflict, and when we finally did join the war, we really joined it and kind of helped finish it. So Wilson is viewed as a rock star, and his proposals have a lot of public support because it seems as though the European method is broken. It seems like the European way of doing things doesn't work anymore. So Wilson proposes what's called the 14 points. It's an outline for peace. Basically, it's 14 things that if we do this, we'll be okay. Calls for free trade, breaking up secret alliances, people should rule over themselves, freedom of the seas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The big thing is self-determination. Obviously, people rule over themselves, and the League of Nations, which is this kind of peacekeeping body to settle the world disputes. Think of it as like a proto-UN, like a pre-UN that doesn't have any real teeth, can't really do anything. So they're your 14 points. Again, these all sound wonderful, except they don't get agreed to frequently. Like case in point, the end of secret treaties. There's no way to enforce that. Freedom of the seas. Why would Britain want freedom of the seas? They own the seas. Their navy is massive. Why the heck would they sign on to that? Free trade can decimate certain economies. The U.S. is pushing for it because we're a massive industrial power. Other countries may desperately want to, nurture and grow their home industry. So his 14 points sound great on paper, but when you really start to sit down and think about how to apply them, you rapidly run into issues here and there. And then the point number 14 is going to be that League of Nations, which is the pre-United Nations, the precursor to the UN. Now, Britain and France, they oppose Wilson's idea and they want to punish Germany. Keep in mind, France is hell-bent on punishing Germany much more than Britain. Britain doesn't want to punish them too severely because they're afraid that there'll be resentment in the hearts of the Germans. The French, they want to destroy Germany. They want to break Germany up back into independent states like it was prior to the unification of Germany. So the French are really are diehard on this thing. And what ends up happening is a bit of a compromise, right? The League of Nations is created, so Wilson gets what he wants. Germany has to accept full blame for the war, as well as Germany has to pay for the damages to the other nations. Well, that's an issue as well. Okay, so France gets what they want, but that's going to be an issue for the Germans. And the League is going to rule over the colonies until deemed ready for independence. Realistically, though, Britain and France really start to encroach upon German colonies and take them over. There's other problems here, right? The Versailles Treaty and other peace accords, they change the look of Europe. Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire, they all lose land and create new countries. Former areas that were controlled by the Ottoman Empire become new colonies or quote-unquote mandates of the League of Nations or Britain or France. Now, again, we call them mandates, but realistically, they're just colonies. The idea with a mandate is that at a specific time in the future, you'll eventually be your own country. But that is really, vague and poorly defined and is up to the conquering power. Russia also gives up a bunch of land here. So this is your pre-World War I. All right, notice you got a couple big countries there in terms of, let me get my pointer out here so you can kind of see. All right, you get your Portugal, your Spain, your France, your Italy, your Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Germans, the Russians. And again, Russia is pretty big. It covers the Baltic states and modern-day Poland and stuff. Romania is kind of tiny down here. And then you go to your new countries. So all of this used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's gone. Serbia, which is this little light purple country here, now is Yugoslavia. So they unite all the Balkan states there, all the Slavic states, and become Yugoslavia. Romania is, probably tripled in size. Austria-Hungary is separate. Czechoslovakia and Poland were made specifically to be a counterweight to Germany. So the argument here is that the Germans are upset that they have to accept full blame for the war, that they have to pay for the war, and that they lost so much territory and land. When, again, in their mind, they didn't surrender. They sued for peace. They said, hey, we should stop fighting. So the idea is that you're going to put Poland and Czechoslovakia there as counterweights to any future German aggression. So France would be happy, right? The idea is that we're not going to break Germany up into small pieces. However, we are going to surround Germany with powerful states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France, so that any future German aggression can be thwarted. At least that's what they hoped. As far as the, Africa and the Middle East, areas up here that were under Ottoman Empire rule are now given to the French or the British. Down here in Africa, same thing. You're giving to the French or the British by and large. Now, there's a problem here. The Treaty of Versailles creates feelings of bitterness on both sides. The Germans are livid. They are angry because they did what they thought was the mature thing. They said we should stop fighting because we can't win the war. The Germans could have kept fighting probably for another 6 months, year, maybe two. They could have kept going. But what's the point? They can't win. They know they aren't going to win. So they keep fighting for 2 years. People die needlessly. There's no point. They give up. They sue for peace. And so in their mind, it's the mature thing. And so they're expecting, okay, they'll probably lose some territory. They'll have to pay some, some reparations, but they didn't think it was going to be accepting full responsibility for the war and the national shame that comes with it. They didn't think they'd have to pay for the entire freaking war. They didn't have to think they'd pay for British and French war bills. They didn't think they'd lose as much of the country as they did. So the Germans are absolutely, they're really angry. This embitters them. And really cuts them deep. They're angry. The Americans, meanwhile, we don't get what we want. Kind of happy for it because it's against Woodrow Wilson. Wilson wanted the League of Nations. He desperately wanted the League of Nations to work, and so he spent his time in Europe, fixing it and building it up, and getting other European countries to approve it. And then, in the great ironies of history, when he comes home, the U.S. Senate refuses to approve the treaty. And so the League of Nations, the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, his own country does not join the League of Nations. We don't join. His idea and his country won't join up. I kind of love that. Okay, so there are some issues here. Not to mention, you figure again, Wilson talked about self-determination. People thought that they would get some freedom here. So when, for example, Chinese delegations, when they arrived, they're like, stop the spheres of influence and get the hell out of our country. Yeah, we're not going to do that. Say the Americans, the British, the French, and so instead of these colonies being, these German colonies and Germany's spheres of influence in China being handed back to the Chinese, they get handed over to the Japanese. So the Chinese are angry. You have people in Africa, the Middle East, who are looking for their independence, who are now being transferred from one colonial overlord to another. So there's resentment there. Japan and Italy, meanwhile, they get angry because they didn't get nearly what they thought. Italy wanted more land. They were promised a lot of territory to join the war when they did. And they only got a fraction of it. Japan, meanwhile, yeah, they got some of the German possessions, but they were expecting more. And they really didn't get that much. So this is a piece that really makes everybody unhappy. And I know sometimes we talk about compromise and we say, well, that's a good thing. If everybody's unhappy, that means you probably did it right. In this case, no. It embitters a lot of people. They don't see the value in this peace treaty. They don't want to listen to the peace treaty. And what they've kind of learned from World War One is that while the fighting itself was futile, they didn't learn that war cannot solve your problems. They look at this and they say, well, the problem seems to be solved. The Germans have been knocked down a significant amount. So why not fight? Why not defeat your enemy through warfare? So that's really how World War One kind of comes to an end, right? The Germans sue for peace. 11th month of the 11th day, 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day, and I know I filed it up again, but November 11th, Armistice Day. All right, they agree to stop shooting. The Treaty of Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference is created to try and resolve some of the issues that World War One creates. And while they do create a new map of Europe, they do create a new League of Nations, they do address some of the issues of France or America and Britain, they ultimately don't resolve the issues that really built up World War One. They don't effectively destroy the need for militarism. The Germans are embittered, they're angry, they are substantially weaker, and they're surrounded by powerful countries. So you haven't reduced the need for militarism from their perspective because they are now in an extraordinarily vulnerable situation that they feel need to build up their military. As far as alliances go, alliances still exist at this time. You didn't eliminate alliances. They're still there. They're eminently useful. So good luck getting rid of that. Imperialism and the competition therein, well, you just had the Germans lose all their colonies so the British and French can get a leg up on each other. So they're still competing when it comes to imperialism. And that sense of nationalism, well, again, we talked about it in the past, not to be cynical, but we say, hate unites. Hate can really unite people long. And let me rephrase. Hate can unite people quickly. It may not unite them for very long, but so long as there's that common bond of hatred, it can bind people together. So that sense of nationalism, where Germans can be angry at the French and be bitter at the French and the British and the Americans and really hate on them, you have reinvigorated that sense of nationalism in Germany. Now, don't get me wrong, some people will be against it completely, but others will use it as a way to kind of combine the Germans together. And we'll see that with the rise of Germany in World War II. So that's how World War One really kind of wraps up. If you have any questions or concerns, as always, feel free to email me, and I look forward to seeing you folks soon.